Hey everybody, welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 11th of March, where we are in the midst of Much Ado About Nothing. So last class, I had asked you to start watching Much Ado About Nothing because we spent most of the class talking about the construction of a paper. Today's class, I'm going to ask you to finish watching Much Ado About Nothing. And if you'll see in the notes below, under the A section, that I've got multiple viewing options. I was able to find an online link for free for which you could watch that piece, but you can also watch it through the GCC library, either through their let's say their DVD collection, for instance. You can always use their interlibrary loan collection as well. And there are other subscription streaming services such as Amazon and YouTube, where I'm sure the film would be available as well. And I just wanted to briefly talk about the play, since most of today's class is watching the performance, and then ask you for today's attendance question if you think that that particular Hollywood production was a successful performance. It's always tricky to adapt Shakespeare to a general audience and particularly a Hollywood audience. I remember first watching this film in the theaters actually in 1993, and it was quite successful. And the people in the theater, broad range of individuals who seemed to enjoy the film. That's not to say that there aren't places in the film that perhaps could be improved. I guess you could say that of any performance. But I'm curious to know what you thought about that adaptation before I add any more commentary about it. But in terms of the play itself, we know that a Shakespearean play divides up into 5 acts and that it follows a pyramid structure. And that the first act, which would be the bottom of the left-hand side of the pyramid, serves as introduction. This is where we are introduced to the main characters and also to the setting and any kind of conflicts. And in this situation, the play is set in Italy. And we know from Midsummer Night's Dream that Shakespeare would oftentimes set his plays in exotic locales, but the reality is outside of that initial establishment, it may as well be occurring in Britain. And what we have are the men returning from war. And might I argue that they are going to enter into a new war, a war of wits and a war of love. And this is a time of great celebration, which you can see in the Burnout production, that everyone is getting ready for the return of the men. And there's lots of imagery of feasting and celebration. And we're supposed to think of Hero and Claudio as our main couple. The reality is that Benedict and Beatrice steal the show. Kenneth Branagh knew that, and he cast himself as Benedict, and he cast his then wife as Beatrice. And I think you can see that there is chemistry between the two. And of course, we need to have a conflict. We've seen conflicts like this before. Now, we know that Governor Leonardo, Hero's father, and Antonio, Leonardo's brother, are going to have power in this particular society because of their age and their position. We know that a prince, such as Don Pedro, and a bastard, Don John, who is a literal and figurative bastard, Don Pedro's brother, would also have a certain amount of power because of their gender and because of their position. A constable, such as Dogberry, would not necessarily have power. That said, even though he's male, we see that he serves as the kind of fool character, which was typical of Shakespeare. We know that that role was played by Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Here is played by Dogberry, who's terribly incompetent but adds humor to the play. And in many ways, spoiler alert, it's because of Dogberry that we get a happy resolution. So we know that in Act 2, the rising action, that what we've got is an almost Cyrano de Bergerac situation where Don John is tricking Claudio about Hero's wooing, The idea is that Don Pedro is trying to woo, or I'm sorry, that that Claudio is trying to woo Hero, and the way that he goes about doing that is that he doesn't feel that he has enough status and that he doesn't have enough honor. So he asks his friend Don Pedro to woo for him. And of course, Don John, our bastard, literal and figurative, takes advantage of that situation by convincing Claudio, and it doesn't take much to convince Claudio that Hero's wooing was really for Don Pedro's benefit and not for Claudio's benefit. Of course, Don Pedro being higher in status. This is some foreshadowing because ultimately we know that Claudio will be very easily duped again. And Don Pedro at that point tries to woo, it's a small scene, Beatrice. And the idea is that, of course, the men have come back from war, so it's time to start some romantic pairings. And Beatrice lets him down easily, which goes to show a softer side to her character because she can come off as rather harsh. And ultimately, Benedict is convinced to woo Beatrice. And we know that Beatrice and Benedict have a past history prior to the play. Each time both maintain that they have no desire to be with one another, we as audience and their friends and family around them are convinced that, yes, they do belong together. These are two basically essentially lonely people that are afraid to show vulnerability when it comes to love. And again, even though Hero and Claudio Hero and Claudio, our younger, inexperienced couple, are supposed to be the, quote, stars of the play, it's Benedict and Beatrice who are older, more mature, and certainly seem to be more suited to one another personality-wise than Hero and Claudio are. Those are the ones who really capture our attention. And when we get to the third act, the height of conflict, this is where Beatrice is convinced to love Benedict. It doesn't take much for their friends and family to convince the other to admit their love. They eavesdrop over here, and that's a major theme in the play. A lot of information is relayed through eavesdropping. The reality is that both Beatrice and Benedict want an excuse to love one another. So once they're given some reason, for instance, that the other is smitten, then it's very easy for them to accept and to, more importantly, publicly admit and also privately admit to themselves their love for the other, because love requires a certain level of vulnerability. And of course, neither one of them wants to be vulnerable. Now, our main point of this play is supposed to be about Hero and Claudio, and I had mentioned this a little bit with A Midsummer Night's Dream about the importance of a woman's virginity during this time period, which is really illustrated when there are accusations that Hero has not been chaste before her marriage. We know that Don John tricks Claudio into thinking that Hero has not been virginal, and all of this is done through, again, eavesdropping. And ultimately, we know that Claudio's love is somewhat suspicious. It's a love of convenience, perhaps, more than a love of depth, something that we see with Benedict and Beatrice. So not only is he easily convinced, but we see how easily Hero's father is willing to humiliate her and abandon her because of the idea that she might not be chaste. A woman at this time would be viewed as basically damaged goods. In Act 4, we see a very brutal reenactment of not only Claudio rejecting the unfaithful Hero at the wedding, but Leonato, Hero's father, doing the same, wishing that Hero be dead, that being dead would be preferable, in effect, to ruining the family honor. There is a friar in this play. He doesn't have a large role. We see him in Act 4, and basically the friar's role is to serve as reason and rationality. He comes up with a scheme so The idea is that Hero can recapture her reputation. In many ways, Hero is dead because her reputation has been killed. And the friar understands human motivation and human conditioning very well, that we value that which we no longer have, so that if Hero's death were to be faked, and of course in some way she is dead because her reputation is dead, then others will begin to appreciate her and the loss of her in their lives, specifically Claudio. And that's exactly what happens. Beatrice shows an enormous amount of strength in this play through her dialogue, and especially, I think, when she asked Benedict to kill Claudio for avenging Hero, or to avenge Hero. And of course, we could take on surface level what she says, that she doesn't have the power or the ability to kill. This reminds me again of Midsummer Night's Dream, where women were not made to woo. Yet, in some ways, what Beatrice is doing is so clever, is because she's having Claudio avenged without having to dirty her hands by, I don't know if manipulating is too strong of a word, encouraging Benedict to do it in her stead. And this is something that we will see with Macbeth as well when we talk about Lady Macbeth. And in fact, if this were a tragedy, then of course that killing would be successful. That murder would be successful. But we know we don't have a tragedy. We have a comedy. So in Act 5, our resolution, yes, Benedict threatens Claudio, but it's Dogberry who saves the day. Who would think? The incompetent constable who exposes Hero's innocence. And Leonato accepts Claudio's apology if Claudio will marry Leonato's niece. Now, there are some political motivations for marriage, as we had talked about in A Midsummer Night's Dream. I've often wondered about Claudio. If Hero's innocence had not been established, would he be willing to admit his error and to ultimately do Leonato's bidding, which I think says a lot, or maybe says very little, in terms of Claudio and his lack of character. Leonato's, quote, niece, unquote, is revealed to be Hero. This is very Shakespearean, where you basically have disguises that will reveal the truth. And this entire play is about reputation, by the way, and the idea of losing one's reputation and how that can mean, in some ways, figurative death. And in this play, could have even resulted in literal death. Claudio and Hero reunite. I don't know if we even care, to be quite honest. What we do care about is Benedict and Beatrice. And Benedict and Beatrice, at the very ending, still show some hesitancy to one another. There are great possibilities for humor there. They're forced to publicly admit their love for one another. They've basically written love notes to one another. So there's physical evidence there. And Don John, the villain, will indeed be punished. And he won't be punished in the play proper. He'll be punished later, because we know that the play proper should end in the proper comedic tone of either marriage or the promise of marriage, with a lot of music and a lot of celebration. So that gives you an idea of the play itself, a play that's set in reality, as opposed to something like A Midsummer Night's Dream that was set in fantasy. But you can see that there's a good overlap in that both of these plays are comedies. So the question for our attendance form, and that'll be due on Friday, the 11th of March. Do you think that Branaghl's 1993 Much Ado About Nothing adaptation was successful? And why or why not? As you know, next week is our spring break. This would be a wonderful time for you to spend some serious consideration of what you might want to write your first paper about. Certainly you can hand in your first paper early, but it's due the week after spring break. We'll put some resolution onto Much Ado About Nothing after we return from the spring break. I'll also post on Moodle that next week is spring break, and just in the event that you forget. And then our next play perhaps is the most challenging play, and that is Richard II, as we move into another genre, which happens to be histories. So we'll talk a little bit about the convention of history plays and why it is that Richard II might be the most challenging play. And I tell you this now because you might want to do a little bit of reading ahead of time if you've got time over the spring break. But certainly spend the spring break finishing reading Much Ado About Nothing if you haven't already done so, because as you know, watching a performance is never a substitute for reading the play, and vice versa. And certainly thinking about your first paper, which I suspect will either be devoted to Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing. You do have the option of writing about the sonnets, but again, writing about a short poem is a very different exercise than writing about a drama, so you want to be careful if you do choose that route. And with that said, I will leave you to finish watching Much Ado About Nothing. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Take care. Bye-bye.